Hi all, today we will discuss top 50 Spring Boot with my MongoDB real-time interview question 2024. So the first question is what is a Spring Boot? Why we are using a Spring Boot? The next question is what is MongoDB? How we will use MongoDB in a Spring Boot? So these type of questions interviewer may ask while you are using for the Spring Boot with microservice and MongoDB requirement. So the next question is how do you connect a Spring Boot application to MongoDB? So we need to add some configuration in application.property or YAML file. The next question is what dependency are required to integrate MongoDB with a Spring Boot? So what all are the dependency required to integrate MongoDB with a Spring Boot? So we have a Spring Boot starter data Mongo and pom.xml, or if you are using build.gradle, that. Now the next question is related for configuration. So the configuration, how do you configure MongoDB property in a Spring Boot application? So we will use a property file or YAML file for this configuration. Now coming for this next question. So if you will go for this MongoDB and application YAML configuration, so the default port is 27017 localhost, and then the next question will be asked the what is the default port of MongoDB. So the same MongoDB default port is 2027017 is the default port. Now the next question may ask how can you create a custom DB settings in a Spring Boot. So we have a Mongo client settings, through that we will do. Now the next question is related for repository question. So what is a Spring Data MongoDB? How we will use, when to use, and all. The next question is how to create a repository for a MongoDB collections in a Spring Boot. So we have Mongo repository, CRUD repositories, and all. The next question is how do you perform CRUD operations in a Spring Boot, a Spring Data MongoDB? So while you used a Mongo repository, then we have a multiple CRUD based methods are there, such as save method, find by IDs, find all, delete by ID, and all. Now coming for the entity mapping question. So how do you define the MongoDB document in a Spring Boot? So if you created a class, then before the class we need to annotate at the rate document and mention the collection as a users or anything. So at the rate document annotations we will use, and then we have IDs, getters, setters, and all will be there. Now, what is the use of at the rate ID annotations in Spring Data MongoDB? When to use at the rate ID annotations? The next question is related for advanced question. So how do you handle relationship in MongoDB using a Spring Boot? Like relationship is a one to one, one to many, or many to many is relationship. The next question is what are embedded document in MongoDB? One to one or one to many relationships and all. Now the next question is how do you create index in MongoDB using a Spring Boot? So while we create an index, we have a multiple annotations at the rate indexes is there. So through that we will do. The next question is related for aggregations and query. So what is aggregation framework in MongoDB? Like match, group, projects, and all. And the next question is how do you perform an aggregation query in a Spring Data MongoDB? So while we go for the aggregation, so here the examples we will use based on the Mongo template. Now, how do you write a custom query in a Spring Data MongoDB? So, if you write the custom query, we have a query annotations is there at the query, and in that we will need to define some custom query. Now, the questions is related for optimization and performance. So, how you optimize MongoDB query in a Spring Boot applications? And the next question is what is the use of index at the rate index annotations in a Spring Data MongoDB? So we have at the rate index annotations which is used for this Mongo data for the indexings and all. Now coming for the testing and debugging. So while testings, how do you test a Spring Boot application in MongoDB? So we have at the rate data Mongo test, through that we will do. And the next question is how do you debug issue related to MongoDB connections in a Spring Boot? So Mongo stat and Mongo stop will be there. Now the coming for the security, how do you secure MongoDB connection in Spring Boot? How do you secure? And the next question is, how do you handle authentications and authorization in Spring Boot with MongoDB? Now the next question is related for real-time use cases. So how do you implement pagination in MongoDB by using a Spring Boot? So while we use paginations, what all are the ways we will follow to add this paginations concept by using MongoDB? The next question is, how do you handle the large data set in MongoDB using a Spring Boot? The next question is, how do you implement full text speech in MongoDB within a Spring Boot? So for that, at the rate text operators we can use in the query. And the next question is, how do you use a grid fs in MongoDB Spring Boot? So grid fs, if you want to use grid fs, then we have a grid fs template will be there that will be uh, used for the operations of grid fs. Now coming for the transactional and concurrency. So how do you handle transactions in MongoDB with a Spring Boot? So we have a Mongo transaction managers is there. Through that we will handle. And the coming for the next question, what is the limitation of MongoDB transaction compared to transactional RDBMS transaction? So MongoDB transaction are less performance and have limited distributed transactions. Coming for this migration and versioning, so while we go for the migration and versioning, then there may be ask some questions. How do you migrate data in MongoDB using a Spring Boot? So for that, mongox integrate with this Spring Boot data versioning and migration. Mongox our custom script we can add for the migrations. Now coming for this, how do you handle next questions, how do you handle this schema changes in MongoDB Spring Boot? Now coming for this cloud integration. So cloud integrations related, the first question is, how do you integrate a Spring data with MongoDB at last? So and coming for the next question is, what all are the benefits of using MongoDB at last using a Spring Boot? And these all are the best practice questions like what are the some best practice using MongoDB with a Spring Boot? And some miscellaneous questions is there. How do you handle exception in Spring Boot applications using MongoDB? So at the rate controller advice, at the rate exception handler and all, we will use this type of annotations. And how do you manage MongoDB collections in a Spring Boot? So we have a Mongo template, through that we will manage. And the next question is, how do you log MongoDB query in a Spring Boot? So this will be in this configuration. So applications.property or YAML there we will use. Now coming for this, what is the role of Mongo template in a Spring Data MongoDB? Mongo template is a central class for performing operations of MongoDB such as query, update, aggregations and all. Now coming for the next, how do you implement caches in a Spring Boot application with MongoDB? So implement caches with a Spring Boot applications will provide Redis cache, caches and many others. So these all are the important questions if you are going for the requirement related for a Spring Boot with MongoDB requirement. So this type of questions interviewer will ask. So interviewer may ask this type of questions. If you want, you can uh, take as a reference for this. Yeah. Thank you.